much, and welcome to everyone from me. Normally I'm in the audience, but this week I'm in the hot seat. So, yes, just to introduce myself a little bit more, my background has been in the Bible translation world, the modern Bible translation world, working through Wycliffe Bible Translators, SIL International, for all of my working career, we might say. And almost all of that was in Sudan and South Sudan, where I was working with local Sudanese Christians who wanted to translate the Bible into their own languages. With others, of course, I was supervising, training, helping, and acting as a consultant to check the work produced over many, many years. I was not actually involved in Bible translation into Arabic at all at that time. That was happening elsewhere in a very different way. But then when we retired, I got linked up somehow with CMCS here, heard that they needed someone to help in their library. That was about 14 years ago. I said I'd come in once a week, and I'm still here. So there you are.
I'm very glad we are too.
Oh, thank you very much, Richard, for that encouragement. So the purpose of this this seminar is to look at what we may consider to be the first translation of the Gospels into Arabic. When I first, when I started getting associated with CMCS, I thought, well, this is the time I must ask the question I've been having in the back of my mind for the last 20 or 30 years. That is, was there a Bible in Arabic before the famous Van Dyck version of 1856? When was the Bible first translated into Arabic? Was it 1,000 years ago, or was it only a few hundred years ago? I simply didn't know, and it's not one of those things that gets talked about an awful lot. So through the late and much lamented Dr. Keith Small, I was directed towards this manuscript in the Vatican Library, manuscript Arabic 13, which it was available online, and was said to be the earliest extant copy of a translation into Arabic of the Gospels that we have. Now, of course, what we don't have, we don't know about. There may have been earlier translations, but if we have no record of them and no trace of them, we can't say. But this one, there is this manuscript, and you see in front of you a small sample of it. It exists only in this one manuscript, just this one manuscript. There are no copies still extant of it. It does not appear to have been adapted or used in other translations later on. And we'll look at the date in a minute. It just exists in this one manuscript, and it is very different, in fact, from all the other early translations of Arabic, which was one thing that attracted my attention. Even what we have of it is not complete. Obviously, over the centuries, parts of it, pages have dropped out or something, so that what we actually have is pretty well the whole of Matthew's Gospel, a large amount of Mark's Gospel, and just a few chapters of Luke, and John is not there at all. But we do have a good sample of data here to look at and consider. So the person who has written most about this version, together with all the other versions of the Gospels in Arabic from the early years, is Dr. Hikmat Kashu of Beirut, who in his amazing study, the Arabic versions of the Gospels, presents his research in which he examined well over 200 separate manuscripts, separate translations from over 21 libraries around the Middle East and Europe of Gospels translated into Arabic in up till about the 12th or 13th centuries AD. And then he compared passages from all of these manuscripts, which he'd copied out, and provided family trees so that one can see now roughly how many groups of translations we have in the Arabic world, and which manuscripts are actually related to which other manuscripts, which version is actually an adaptation of an earlier version, and so on. Until his work, it was impossible to tell that. Every manuscript was simply known by its name, like Vatican Arabic Manuscript 13, and no one knew if it was related to anything else. He divided them into families, and he called the translation in this version H. He was giving the different families alphabetical names, but H is a family that consisted of only one member. So other scholars had commented on small parts of this over the last 200 years, but only on very small passages and so on. Oh, sorry. Yes, you're welcome. So my research, I thought I should look at it properly and study the Gospel of Matthew verse by verse. So I have transcribed it, I have compared it with the Greek and with the Syriac standard version, the Peshitta, and with the old Syriac versions, the Curetonian and the Sinaiticus, which date from the 2nd to 3rd centuries, whereas the Peshitta is somewhere around, I believe, the 5th century. And looking at each verse in that translation. Hikmat Kashub dated the manuscript, the bit you can see in front of you, to the year around 800 AD. He did that on the basis of calligraphy, which is a bit beyond my pay grade, so I won't comment on that. But what you see, this actual manuscript dates, he reckons, from about 800, and I've not seen anyone quarrel with that. However, he dates the translation of this version, of which this manuscript is a copy of a copy of a copy, in the way that ancient literary works existed. The translation he dates as early 7th century, either contemporary with or before the rise of Islam, which raises big questions. And so if there was a translation of the Gospels in Arabic before the time of the Prophet Muhammad, that raises all sorts of questions for Christians and Muslims. So it's worth looking at. I'll try using the arrows.
Yeah.
Yes. So what this raises the question about is, when was this translated? Where was it translated? For whom was it translated? And from what version? So, as I said, I studied it verse by verse. And what I was able to establish was that it was definitely translated from the Syriac, not from the Greek. In fact, there's virtually no trace of the Greek New Testament in this translation. I found about 400 instances in Matthew's Gospel where H follows either the Greek as against the Syriac, or the Syriac as against the Greek. In other words, when the Greek and the Syriac have slightly different meanings. And in 95% of those cases, it is a Syriac that this version is following. The remainder is quite small enough to be accounted for by coincidence. So that would point to it being translated from the Syriac. quite apart from the fact that you get some features like the disciple Peter in H is always referred to in Arabic as As-Safa, the rock, parallel to the Syriac term Kifa, which we know in English as Cephas, and the standard Arabic, or what became the standard Arabic term Butrus for Peter, does not occur at all in this translation, which is interesting because the translator of this version seems to vary his terms quite a lot, but he does not vary the translation of the name Peter. And also, there are Syriac idioms that are coming through. Most translators find it very difficult to escape from the idioms of the translation that they're working from. So many African translators I've worked with who are working from an English version will quite often put an English idiom into their translation. And it was part of my job to watch out for those and say, now, do you really say that in your language? For instance, in Matthew 17, verse 15, where a man says to Jesus, my son has epileptic fits, this translation in Arabic has, for my son has a demon that appears to him from over the rooftop. Well, that's a bit of an odd translation, but what does the Syriac say? The Syriac has an idiom. For my son has a son of the rooftop, which refers to a Syriac belief, understanding that demons that cause fits appear over housetops, which does appear to show us that the translator here was following the Syriac. Also, the translator, we learn from this analysis something of the translator's situation, and that is that it was not Palestine. The manuscript itself is known to have come to the Vatican from a monastery in Palestine, and Sidney Griffiths, a great expert on the Arabic Bible, does at various points say that all the earliest translations were translated in the monasteries of South Palestine. But Hikmet Kashu, from his reading of this manuscript, says no, he does not think that it came from Palestine. He considers that the type of Arabic it's using is not South Palestinian Arabic, as in all the other 8th, 9th, 10th century translations that he looked at. This is more like classical Arabic. So it would appear to have come from some other part of the Arab world. Also, the translator does appear to have problems with certain things in his translation. For instance, place names in Palestine, like even Jerusalem, he has at least 4 spellings of. Now, I don't know about you, but I would have expected someone living in a monastery in South Palestine, not too many miles from Jerusalem, and speaking Arabic, and this translator clearly spoke good Arabic and wrote good Arabic, and one would have thought that he would have known how to spell Jerusalem, or at least how to say Jerusalem and then spell it. Foreign names are a problem for anyone in translation because they're obviously not part of your language. But this is a bit suspicious if he was in Palestine. Moreover, he seems to be a bit unfamiliar with biblical culture and things that one would expect someone in Palestine to have understood, especially someone in a monastery. For instance, when in Matthew 23, there's a reference to the gold in the temple, his translation reads, the gold which is on the roof of the temple, as if he'd seen buildings with adorned gold, roofs adorned with gold, but he wasn't aware that the temple in Jerusalem would have had items or stores of gold in it. Similarly, when there's a reference to a coin in Matthew 10, which in English I think is generally translated as a penny, he clearly didn't even know the Syriac term for that, and translated instead of a penny or whatever, or some coin, something weird like they are sold for an agreed amount or a contract, which is not a translation. And again, the passage in Matthew 15 about Korban, which when Jesus is rebuking the Pharisees, he has a great deal of trouble, and his translation doesn't make a lot of sense. Moreover, it's interesting to see that in the Syriac versions, there are quite a number of Greek loanwords in the Syriac. So terms like centurion and legion from the Latin via the Greek turn out as something like kenprona and so on. And the terms for a company of soldiers, speira, or the praetorium, or the general, the governor, hegemon, or even the law, are transliterated loanwords in the Syriac version, which the translator was working from. But in each of those places, he either goes for an extremely generic term to translate the thing, or he tries having different words, so that the passage about a centurion, which probably covers about 12 verses, contains at least 3 different translations for the word centurion, instead of repeating one, as if the translator was not sure which word was supposed to convey this. It was obviously some sort of soldier, and so on. So he didn't even have enough understanding of Greek to pick out a meaning for Greek words in Syriac. And lastly, which no one, I think, has pointed out before, this translation contains 1 or 2 Persian terms, just in odd places. But for instance, when Peter denies Jesus in the court of the high priest, the bird which crows is not a deek, as normally in Arabic. It's an utrafan, which is a Persian word used in Mesopotamian Arabic in very early period, pre-Islamic and so on. And in one place he has a term for soldiers, jalawiza, which is not used really anywhere in standard Arabic ever since this, except that I did find a friend of mine who does Arabic into English translations said, yes, I have come across that in 1 or 2 Iraqi newspapers and so on. And it is related to a Persian word for soldiers or guards or heavies. My research concludes that this is not a pre-Islamic translation. It probably, in my view, dates from around the year 700. And so we'll see now why. Because there are various Islamic elements that pop up in the translation. First of all, influences from Islamic terminology and style. So that in a couple of places in the Gospel, we get these salawat. When God is mentioned, he is given the salawat, tabarak wa ta'ala, may he be praised and exalted, which is very common in Islamic materials, not common in Christian materials, certainly in Christian materials intended for Christians. So why? If it was pre-Islamic, how on earth did that get in there? Of course, it only occurs a couple of times. This translator is never consistent. But clearly, in his milieu, in what he's hearing from day to day, these terms were used. And a couple of times when he translated the word God, he put in, may be praised and exalted, because that's what he heard around him all the time. And in chapter 24, verse 29, where Jesus is talking about the end days, he refers to the fact that the sun will be darkened. But that turns out in this translation as the sun becomes dark and is wrapped around. Now, why add that second phrase there, and is wrapped around? Well, it's very reminiscent of chapter 81, At-Takwir, in the Quran, which refers to when the sun is wrapped around. And it's the same verb there, kuwar. So you get the impression that the translator had heard that. Someone quoting the Quran, or he knew it anyway. And in chapter 13, where Jesus is giving the parable of the wheat and the weeds in the field being harvested together, and then the weeds being thrown into a furnace of fire, as the sinners are thrown into a furnace of fire, he uses the phrase, the Arabic word ukhdud, which doesn't mean a furnace, it means a trench. Why? A furnace is not a trench. Why should someone translate one with the other? Unless they had heard from the Quran the phrase about the trench, the fire supplied with fuel. I did recently come across a hadith which actually links those two words together. So it does appear that there was, people talked about people being thrown in trenches of fire or thrown in furnaces of fire. So these look like Quranic echoes very much. Secondly, the translator very often adds in bits to the translation, things which look very odd to us in a modern translation, but for some reason he did it. So that in Matthew 17, where Jesus and disciples came to Capernaum, the Syriac text says, at that point there approached those who took the 2 drachmas of the poll tax, the Cephas. Well, the translator of our version gets most of that. There approached those who used to take the 2 drachmas of the jizya, and then he feels he needs to add in, and that was not for the jizya, but for the repair of the house of God, to Cephas. Now, it sounds very much here as if the translator felt that the Christians who heard this must not get the idea that Jesus had to pay the jizya, which they had to pay. This was, jizya is actually, of course, a common term for a tax, a head tax, and is used elsewhere with that meaning in this translation. But the translator felt worried that people might get the wrong end of the stick here, and so he adds this in, that Jesus, of course, didn't have to pay the jizya. This was a tax for the house of God. And then when Jesus rebukes the people of the Jews of his day as a generation that is not believing, that comes out as the generation that leaves the faith. Well, that's 2 slightly different things, and if I was working with a translator in Sudan and he made that translation, I would certainly want to know why. And I suspect this translator would have said, well, that's the problem, isn't it? People keep on leaving Christianity and converting to Islam. Then in chapter 22, where this is actually the Pharisees coming up to Jesus and buttering him up a little bit by saying, Rabbi, we know that you are trustworthy and that you teach the word of God truthfully. But our translator comes out with, we know that you are trustworthy in what you have come to do, and that you teach people to follow the way of God and to act in obedience to it rightly and truly. So, my audience, get the message. Yeah. And 1 or 2 other places along a similar line, the translator seems to have felt that the character of Jesus needed defending, possibly because with a new and increasingly Islamic milieu that he was living in, Jesus kept on being referred to as a prophet. And for Christians, Jesus is more than a prophet. And we don't like Jesus just being referred to as a prophet. And so, just in a straightforward narrative passage like Matthew 20:29, where Jesus is leaving Jericho and is joined by a large crowd, he adds in a little phrase: this was an honor and a mark of respect for him. Just so as you know, in those days they did respect Jesus. And again, in chapter 26, where Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane is about to be arrested, it talks about the soldiers laid hands on Jesus. But it would appear that our translator thought that is a bit sacrilegious, not in accordance with the dignity of our Saviour. So his translation reads, they stretched out their hands towards Jesus and then took him away. So this does look like an Islamic situation. Now, there do appear to be some other interesting points where the translator appears to be aware of Muslim sensitivities. In modern translation world, in recent years, there's been quite a controversy about translating the term Son of God or God the Father. And in a couple of places, the translator of this version does say, rather than you are the Son of God, he said, if you are a son for God or of God. Now, in other places, he does use the term the Son of God, but why not be consistent there? Unless you are aware that that term is generally watered down for the sake of our Muslim brothers. And also the aspect of anthropomorphism, ascribing human features to God, which is a problem for Muslims. And in Matthew 18, verse 10, where it talks, Jesus is talking about the angels who see the face of my Father. Instead of referring to the face of God, he says, who are standing before my Father, which actually is a perfectly good translation, gets across the point that Jesus is making. The angels are in the presence of God. But it does look like an avoidance of an anthropomorphic feature. So we then come to some places where there appear to be what you might call direct attacks on Islam. But I don't think they are polemic against Islam. They're more like warnings to Christians of the day against what Christians see as errors of Islam. So that Matthew 13:57, which we know colloquially in English as a prophet is not despised save in his own town and country and so on, that comes out as something a bit different. There is not a prophet who is worthless and despicable except the prophet who prophesies in his town and in his residence and in his family. It's not a general statement about prophets and the fact that, in their own town, people don't, say, oh yeah, that's Jesus, we knew him as a kid. It now becomes an attack on a particular prophet. And in several places where Jesus talks to the scribes and Pharisees and talks about your traditions, rather than using a word for tradition, this translator uses the term commandments and refers to the sham commandments that are in your hands, or your teachings, which are human commands, and so on, or even uses the term bid'ah, meaning innovations. Since presumably those were the sort of things that Christian preachers at the time were saying about Islam. They're commanding you this, that, and the other, but those are sham. They're not true commands. They're sham commands, and they're innovating. So, from this, we see that the translation H is confirmed as not being pre-Islamic. There are too many Islamic traces in it. And yet it was clearly early, after the publication of the Quran, or the Quran became known at least. So further evidence of that, of the early date, is the fact, as I've mentioned, that this translator keeps on giving me a case of deja vu. I find something, I think, oh, I've seen translators do that 17 times, and whatever. And all the translators I have worked with have been translating the Bible into their own language when there is no existing translation already in that language. And most cases when there's no literature whatsoever in that language. And that makes me think, was this guy in the same sort of situation? We get examples of chains of synonyms, of varying spellings of names, and of alternative translations. Here are examples of that. For instance, in Matthew 12:45, where the text just refers to the evil generation, it is given as Al-Kabila, Al-Kabitha, Al-Radia, Al-Fajra, which we might translate as the evil, terrible, awful generation. As if the translator didn't know which term to choose, so he puts the whole lot in. This is a very common feature. This occurs time and time again, even in Matthew's Gospel. Similarly, I mentioned before the problem of names. When you're dealing with something from a foreign language, how do you spell this foreign name? If you come across a Chinese name, Xi Jinping, how are you going to spell that in English? Well, most English people, we would know that unless we've actually seen his name written before. So we would probably come up with various different translations of it, transcriptions of it. And that's what happens with the name John. There are at least 4 ways of writing it in Arabic that this translator uses, with no particular reason. And then alternative translations. This is a strange thing. But for instance, in Matthew, sorry, I have to look at my copy here. Matthew 24:43, when Jesus is talking about if a house owner had known that the burglar was coming, he would have prevented him from breaking into his house. But what our translator says is literally, he would make breaking into his house impossible, or he would prevent any damage to his house. I'm not quite sure how to translate this, but these are my 2 versions, and you can choose which one you like. And I've actually seen translators do that. They say, well, you tell me, sir, which one of these is best? And I say, look, it's your language. You've got to choose and make up your mind. I'll tell you what the original is meaning. So I think this guy was a pioneer. Secondly, and this is something that Hikmat Kashu goes on quite a length about, this version does use some very archaic terms. It uses its standard term for the disciples. It's not the common Talamid, or even the Quranic Al-Hawariyun or Al-Awliya, which it does use in a few places. The standard term is Al-Arriba. which is never used, meaning disciples, anywhere else in extant Arabic literature, but it is used throughout this translation to translate the disciples. It must have been a very early form used by Arabic Christians to speak about the disciples. I mean, otherwise, why would the translator use it? You only use terms that you know your audience are going to understand. You don't make them up. An alternative form he uses is al-arda, which is rare, but it does occur elsewhere. And Elijah is not referred to as in the Quran, Ilyas, which comes from the Greek, but as Ilya or El-Yasin, which is interesting because that does occur once in the Quran, but is never used in any later Arabic translation. So if this translator had seen other Arabic translations, he would surely have copied the form of names from it. So, my conclusions, you'll be pleased to know I'm coming to the end. When was this translation translated? Well, the original version, H, was produced after the appearance of Islam. Unfortunately, there is no evidence yet of any New Testament material predating Islam that the Prophet would have actually seen or heard in his own language. It seems that pre-Islamic Arabic Christianity, and there had been numbers of Arab Christians for a century or two before the time of Muhammad, they simply had the Bible in Syriac or in some parts in Greek. And what was it translated from? This was definitely translated from Syriac. Later versions translated in Palestine were translated from Greek or from Syriac or from one and then touched up by bits of the other. But this one is very definitely translated from Syriac, but not from the Peshitta, which might be of interest to Syriac scholars. Where was it translated? Well, my theory is probably the town of Al-Hira in Mesopotamia, which is now part of the city of Kufa. In pre-Islamic times, it was the capital of the Lakhmid Arab kingdom. It was part of the Persian Empire, the Sassanid Persian Empire, and acted as a buffer state and a trading point between Persia and Arabs. So there was a lot of Persian coming through it. And also, it is known, writer Isabel Torol-Neidhoff has written about the Ibad of Al-Hira in the pre-Islamic and Islamic period, who were a well-known large community of Christians who had migrated to Al-Hira and were fairly high up in the commercial and diplomatic world of the city and the Lakhmid state, and were known as particularly for their abilities in translation between Syriac and Arabic, also between Persian and Arabic. And in fact, there are records apparently even into the Abbasid period of the Ibad acting as translators between different languages and Arabic in Al-Hira. So that would be my guess. It fits with the Mesopotamian and Persian links that we have seen. For whom? Well, it was clearly translated for Arabic-speaking Christians in the context of an ascendant Islam. It's not aimed at Muslims. That just wouldn't work, and it's very unlikely. These Christians would either have been native Arabic-speaking Christians from the pre-Islamic Arab churches, which existed in that part of Arabia. Conceivably, it may have been produced in Al-Hira for groups like those in Najran in Yemen. That's a speculation that Cashew makes, but I don't see any particular evidence for that, but it could have been. Or these would have been, the audience may have been non-Arabs from the previously Aramaic-speaking populations of Mesopotamia before the Arab invasions with Islam. The peasants of Mesopotamia were Aramaic-speaking and would have been able to understand probably most of the Syriac used in churches. But once they drop their Aramaic and speak Arabic, they're at a great disadvantage. And lastly, how was it translated? Why is it so odd? And the possibility is that this might represent an informal sort of translation, not one intended for liturgical use. You can hardly use it sort of in a liturgy with all these extra bits in it and alternative translations and whatever. Not intended for private study. That may have not been a particular situation at that time. But Ronnie Vollant, in his Arabic versions of the Pentateuch, does talk about a practice in churches of that period where Arabic was becoming a more common language for the congregation, that a liturgical reading of the scriptures in one language, whether it was Greek or Syriac, might have been verbally, orally translated afterwards by a priest or someone standing up and saying, basically, well, what you've just heard said, da 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 da. And out of that might have grown the idea of writing something like this down. Because in the period around by the beginning of the 8th century, Christians in Arabia would have been seeing Muslims around them, coming up with a Quran, quoting to them from the book in their language. And where's your book, Christians? Well, perhaps we better translate something into our language. Who knows? Thank you.